In 380 AD, a Roman emperor issued a 16-line document that made it illegal to worship the gods his own father had worshipped. No debate, no council, no popular vote, one edict, one signature. And 1,000 years of religious plurality died on a Wednesday afternoon in Thessalonica. If that is true, if the faith you were told spread peacefully through the ancient world was actually installed by imperial decree, then everything you were told about Christianity's rise rests on a foundation that was never faith at all. It was legislation, and legislation can be examined. What follows is not an argument against belief. It is not an attack on any living tradition. It is a forensic examination of what the historical record actually says about the moment one religion became mandatory and every other became a crime. The documents exist. The dates are confirmed. The scholars have been arguing about the implications for over a century. You deserve to see what they've found. By the end of this, you will know the name of the specific legal mechanism that criminalized Roman paganism in 380 AD. And you will understand why that single administrative act was more decisive for the shape of Western civilization than any miracle, any apostle, or any gospel ever written. There is a moment in every institutional takeover when the thing being replaced does not yet know it is being replaced. It still performs its rituals, it still fills its temples, it still believes in its own legitimacy. And then a document arrives. The Edict of Thessalonica was issued on February 27th, 300 AD, by Emperor Theodosius I, co-signed by Emperors Gratian and Valentinian II. Its formal Latin title was Cunctos Populus, all peoples. The edict opened with an instruction to every subject of the Roman Empire. They were to profess the faith delivered to the Romans by the Apostle Peter, specifically the Trinitarian formulation defended by Damasus I of Rome and Peter II of Alexandria. This was not an invitation. The edict stated explicitly that those who did not comply would be considered demented and insane, and would be subject to divine punishment first, and then to punishment administered by the emperor himself. Read that again. Divine punishment first, imperial punishment second. Theodosius had arranged the order carefully. He was not merely legislating faith. He was positioning the state as the enforcement mechanism of God. Theodosius was not a lifelong Christian zealot. He was baptized in 380 AD, the same year he issued the edict, baptized, in fact, while recovering from a near-fatal illness in Thessalonica, which is why the document carries that city's name. The timing matters. A man who had been a Christian for perhaps a matter of weeks issued an order that restructured the spiritual architecture of the entire Roman world. What does that tell you about the nature of the decision? It tells you it was not primarily theological. It was administrative. The Roman Empire in 380 was under extraordinary stress. The western provinces were fragmenting. Germanic pressure on the Danube frontier had culminated in the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople in 378, where Emperor Valens, Theodosius's predecessor in the east, had been killed by Visigothic forces. The empire needed internal cohesion. It needed a single organizing principle around which fragmented loyalties could be consolidated. Christianity, with its already functioning network of bishops, its administrative infrastructure, and its clear chain of doctrinal authority, offered exactly that. The Edict of 380 was not a conversion. It was a merger. Historian Peter Heather, in The Fall of the Roman Empire, 2006, frames Theodosius's religious policy as inseparable from his political consolidation strategy. The Nicene Creed, already formulated at the Council of Nicaea in 325 under Constantine, gave Theodosius a doctrinal standard he could enforce. It was specific enough to exclude rivals, broad enough to unite the majority, and backed now by the full weight of imperial law. What happened to the gods that had held Roman society together for 8 centuries? They became, legally, a form of insanity. You need to understand what Rome's religious world actually looked like before 380. It was not what you were taught. The Roman religious system was not a single competing faith. It was a vast, pluralistic ecology. Romans worshipped Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Minerva, and dozens of other Olympian figures as the official civic religion, the Religio Romana. But alongside this ran an equally legitimate universe of mystery cults, imported Eastern religions, local provincial deities, and philosophical schools that functioned as spiritual practices. Mithraism, originally from Persia, had deep penetration among the Roman military. The cult of Isis had been officially tolerated since the 1st century. Neoplatonic philosophy, as practiced by figures like Plotinus and later Porphyry, provided a sophisticated intellectual spirituality for the educated classes. Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, was an official imperial cult under emperors, including Aurelian and, this is frequently overlooked, Constantine himself, who retained it well past his supposed Christian conversion. The Roman citizen of 300 A.D. did not experience religion the way a modern Westerner does. There was no single book. There was no single truth claim that demanded the rejection of all others. When a Roman soldier stationed in Britain also participated in a local shrine to a Celtic water goddess, this was not syncretism in the modern sense. It was simply how the world worked. Different powers required different acknowledgments. The gods were real in the way weather was real. You worked with them, not against them. Bart Ehrman, in The Triumph of Christianity, 2018, provides precise estimates. At the death of the Apostle Paul, around 65 AD, there were perhaps 1,000 to 1,500 Christians in the entire Roman Empire, in a population of roughly 60 million. By 300 AD, 3 centuries of mission work and martyrdom later, the number had grown to perhaps 3 to 4 million. Impressive. Remarkable even, but still a small minority. Perhaps 5 to 7% of the population. Christianity did not take Rome. Rome took Christianity. And there is a difference. What ended the pluralistic world was not superior theological argument. What ended it was the legal machinery that Theodosius set in motion. After 380, the edict itself was followed, within the same decade, by a series of legislative actions that progressively stripped pagan practice of its legal standing. In 381, non-Nicene Christians, Arians primarily, lost their right to hold church assemblies. In 382, state funding for pagan temples was withdrawn. In 391, a further imperial decree, Theodosianus 161-010, prohibited any form of pagan sacrifice, even in private. In 392, Theodosianus 161-012 extended this to ban any form of pagan veneration whatsoever. No incense, no garlands, no libations, under pain of serious financial penalty. The temples were not all immediately destroyed. They were simply starved of legal oxygen until they became archaeological sites instead of living institutions. The mechanism was bureaucratic. That is what makes it extraordinary. Not fire, not armies, paper. Consider what was lost, and be precise about it. When the temples closed and the funding dried up, and the festivals became illegal, it was not merely a set of religious practices that vanished. It was a complete system of civic identity that had no language to survive in the new order. The Vestal Virgins, the 6 priestesses who had tended the sacred flame of Rome for over 1,000 years, whose rites were considered essential to the safety of the city itself, had their office abolished by Theodosius in 394 A.D. The eternal flame that had burned for centuries was extinguished by administrative order on a specific day by a specific official. We do not know her name, the last Vestal who watched it go out. The Olympic Games, held continuously since 776 BC by traditional reckoning, were abolished in 393 AD. Theodosius ordered them ended as a pagan religious observance. They would not return for 15 centuries, until 1896. That is not a footnote. That is a direct consequence of the 380 edict and its successors. Think about the thread of human continuity that was cut. The Temple of Serapis in Alexandria, the Serapeum, one of the ancient world's most magnificent structures, a building that housed a daughter collection of the great Alexandrian library, was destroyed in 391 AD. The destruction was carried out by a Christian mob, reportedly led or sanctioned by Theophilus, Bishop of Alexandria. Theophilus had imperial backing. He had legal cover. The Theodosianus decree of that year had given him all the authority he needed. Scholars debate the precise scope of the destruction and the extent of the library materials lost. What is not debated is that the building was demolished and that the imperial legal framework made it not merely possible, but defensible. The historian Ramsay MacMullen, in Christianizing the Roman Empire in 1984, makes a careful argument that the conversion of Rome to Christianity was accomplished not primarily through persuasion, but through what he calls power, the progressive social, legal, and economic pressure applied to communities that had not converted. By the 5th century, refusing Christianity had practical consequences: loss of government positions, legal disadvantages in property disputes, inability to serve in certain civic roles. The faith spread, in significant part, because belonging to it became materially advantageous, and refusing it became materially costly. This is not what you were taught, and you are entitled to ask why. Why does the framing matter? Because the story you were given about Christianity's triumph shapes how you understand the nature of religious authority today. The conventional narrative goes roughly like this: Christianity spread because it was true, or because it was morally superior, or because it met a spiritual need that Roman polytheism could not. It won a fair contest of ideas. The old gods fell because no one believed in them anymore, and no one believed in them because they were not real. That narrative is comfortable. It is also incomplete. What the historical record shows is that the contest was not fair. It was decided by law, and the law was issued by a man who had been a Christian for perhaps 8 weeks. Elaine Pagels, in the Gnostic Gospels, 1979, makes a point that applies here with force. The Christianity that survived into the modern world was not the only Christianity that existed. It was the one that aligned most effectively with centralized imperial authority. A church with a bishop at the top, a creed that could be legally enforced, and an institutional structure compatible with the Roman administrative model. The Gnostic Christians, the Arian Christians, the countless local variants. They did not lose a theological argument. They lost a legal one. N.T. Wright, whose scholarship comes from a very different theological direction than Pagels, nonetheless acknowledges in Paul and the Faithfulness of God, 2013, that the relationship between Christianity and imperial power was complicated from the beginning, and that Constantine's patronage fundamentally altered what the church was and what it thought it was doing. The Christianity of the catacombs and the Christianity of the imperial court were not the same religion. The Edict of 380 was the moment the court version became the only legal version. You were told, Christianity won the ancient world. That is true. You were not told exactly how. There is a figure at the center of this story who receives far less attention than he deserves. His name was Ambrose of Milan. And if Theodosius was the hammer, Ambrose was the hand that swung it. Ambrose was Bishop of Milan from 374 to 397 AD. He was not a theologian who became an administrator. He was a Roman provincial governor, a trained lawyer and political operative who was elected bishop by popular acclamation in 374 before he had even been baptized. He was baptized, ordained as a deacon, ordained as a priest, and consecrated as a bishop in the space of 8 days. The church needed a political operator, and it got one. Ambrose's relationship with Theodosius is one of the most remarkable case studies in the exercise of institutional religious power in the ancient world. When Theodosius, in 390 AD, ordered a massacre at Thessalonica, in retaliation for the murder of a Roman military commander, killing an estimated 7,000 civilians in a theater where they had been invited under false pretenses, Ambrose did something unprecedented. He refused the emperor communion. He wrote Theodosius a private letter, preserved in Ambrose's own collected letters, demanding that the emperor perform public penance before being readmitted to the sacraments. Theodosius, the most powerful man in the known world, complied. He performed public penance in the cathedral at Milan. Think carefully about what that moment represents. A bishop had coerced an emperor into public humiliation, using the administrative machinery of a religion that 20 years earlier had been one of many legal faiths in the empire. The Edict of 380 had given the church the state's power. The penance of Theodosius demonstrated that the exchange also ran in the other direction. The church could now discipline the state. This is the template for the relationship between religious and political authority that would define Europe for the next 1,000 years. It was established, specifically and precisely, in 390 AD in a cathedral in northern Italy by a bishop who had been a lawyer, Paul of Frederickson, in Augustine and the Jews, 2008, traces how the theological and legal frameworks established in this period by figures like Ambrose and later his pupil Augustine of Hippo created the architecture of religious coercion that would persist into the medieval period and beyond. The Inquisition did not emerge from nowhere. It emerged from a set of legal and theological precedents established in the late 4th century. The line runs directly. What happened to the people who did not comply? What happened to the Romans who still believed in Jupiter, or still lit incense to Isis, or still gathered at the temples that their families had attended for generations? The answer is complex, and honesty requires saying so. The enforcement of the Theodosianus decrees was uneven. In rural areas and in the eastern provinces, pagan practice continued in various forms well into the 5th and even 6th centuries. The historian John Curran, in Pagan City and Christian Capital 2000, documents the persistence of non-Christian practice in Rome itself long after the official edicts. The state did not have the administrative capacity to enforce religious uniformity at the household level. What it could do was make public practice untenable. The word pagan itself requires examination. In classical Latin, paganus meant a rural person, a civilian, someone outside the military. Its adoption as a term for non-Christians appears to have emerged in the 4th century, possibly from Christian soldiers who used the military metaphor. They were soldiers of Christ. Those outside were civilians. pagani. By the time of the Theodosianus decrees, it had acquired the meaning we recognize, a follower of the old religions. It was a legal category before it was a theological one. The philosopher Hypatia of Alexandria was murdered in 415 AD, dragged from her chariot by a Christian mob, killed, and her body burned. She was not killed for being a threat to orthodox doctrine. She was a Neoplatonist mathematician and astronomer, a teacher whose students included both pagans and Christians. She was killed in the context of a political dispute between Bishop Cyril of Alexandria and the Roman prefect Orestes, with whom Hypatia was associated. But the mob that killed her understood something about the legal and cultural moment they were in. Non-Christian intellectual identity was no longer protected. The Theodosianus framework had established that. The mob did not need an explicit order. They had an atmosphere. This is what legal frameworks do. They do not always produce direct enforcement. They produce climates, and climates produce actions that no specific decree authorized, but that no decree prevented. There is an argument that must be addressed before this account can be called complete. It is the argument from historical necessity. The argument goes like this. The Roman Empire was already fragmenting. Some form of unifying ideological framework was required to maintain coherent governance over the vast territories of the late imperial period. Christianity happened to be the most administratively functional option available. Theodosius did not destroy a working pluralistic society. He was managing a society already in crisis, using the best tool available to him. The loss of the old religions was regrettable, but structurally inevitable. This is a serious argument. Edward Gibbon made a version of it in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, 1776. Peter Brown's monumental work The World of Late Antiquity, 1971, complicates the picture further, suggesting that the transition from the classical to the Christian world was not a violent rupture but a gradual, complex negotiation in which pagan and Christian elements interpenetrated extensively. These arguments deserve respect. The historical reality was not clean. It was not a single villain issuing a single decree that ended everything overnight. The process was long, uneven, and full of contradiction. And yet, the Edict of 380 was real. The Theodosianus decrees were real. Hypatia was real. The Vestal flame went out on a real day. The Olympic Games were abolished in a real year. The Serapeum fell in a real afternoon. Whatever the complexity of the larger process, these specific events occurred. They were caused by specific decisions made by specific human beings, acting under specific legal authorities, and the record of those decisions is available to anyone who chooses to read it. Complexity is not the same as ambiguity. The record is complex. Its existence is not ambiguous. There is a second argument to address. The claim that Christianity would have won regardless, because it was spiritually superior, because it met genuine human needs that the old religions could not. This argument deserves the same forensic attention. Is it true that Christianity spread because it offered something the old religions did not? In certain respects, yes. John Dominic Crossan, in The Birth of Christianity, 1998, and Rodney Stark, in The Rise of Christianity, 1996, a sociologist's rather than a theologian's account. Both document the ways in which early Christian communities provided genuine social support networks, care for the sick, burial societies, community cohesion across class lines. In the context of frequent epidemic disease in the ancient world, these were not trivial advantages. Communities that cared for their sick had higher survival rates. Christianity's theology of love and mutual care had practical consequences. These are real factors. They deserve acknowledgement. But here is the problem with the argument from spiritual superiority. The Christianity that won was not primarily the Christianity of mutual care and burial societies. The Christianity that was installed by the Edict of 380 was a specific, legally defined Trinitarian orthodoxy that had been contested within Christian communities for decades. The Arian Christians, who believed that the Son was subordinate to the Father, a position that had enormous support across the Eastern Empire, were not less caring, not less devoted, not spiritually deficient. They lost, not because their version of faith failed its adherents, but because their version of faith was on the losing side of the Council of Nicaea in 2005 and the subsequent imperial enforcement. The faith that met genuine human needs and the faith that was imposed by imperial decree were not necessarily the same faith. That distinction is important. It is not made often enough. What does any of this mean for you? Not as a historical curiosity, not as a theological debate, but as a practical matter, today, in the world you actually live in. You live in a civilization whose fundamental categories, whose concepts of sin and redemption, whose architecture, whose calendar, whose legal traditions, whose university system, whose art, whose entire inherited framework for thinking about the relationship between the individual and the transcendent, were shaped in decisive ways by decisions made in the 4th century A.D. Those decisions were not purely theological, they were political. They were administrative. They were made by specific human beings with specific interests, operating under specific constraints. The Christianity that shaped your world was not handed down from heaven intact. It was constructed, debated, revised, enforced, and institutionalized by people who were also managing an empire. This does not mean it is false. It does not mean it is true. Those are different questions, and this account does not answer them. What it means is that the faith you inherited, whatever your relationship to it, came to you through a filter. That filter was forged in 380 A.D. in Thessalonica. It was refined in Milan by a bishop who had been a lawyer. It was enforced through bureaucratic decrees, collected in a legal code called the Theodosianus. It was maintained by the deliberate extinction of alternatives. You were told, the old gods fell because no one believed in them. The record says something more precise. They fell because belief in them was made illegal. Their funding was cut, their temples were demolished or repurposed, their priesthoods were disbanded, and their practitioners were defined, in the language of imperial law, as demented. The last recorded state sacrifice in Rome occurred in 394 A.D. at the Battle of the Frigidus, where Theodosius's forces defeated the usurper Eugenius, who had briefly restored pagan practice to the Western court. After that battle, it was finished. Theodosius died in 395. By 400 A.D., the legal framework was set. The pluralistic religious world of Rome, 8 centuries of it, had been compressed into the span of a single generation. One generation, one legal document, 16 lines in Latin, and the world your ancestors built their entire civilization on was reclassified as madness. If that does not make you want to read the primary sources, if that does not make you want to hold the Theodosianus in your hands and read what it actually says, then nothing will. The documents are available. The scholarship is real. The history is yours. Go find it. And the next time someone tells you that Christianity won the ancient world because truth always wins in the end, you can ask them, gently, precisely, by name. What was the Cunctos Populos Edict of February 27, 380 A.D.? Ask them to explain it. Watch what happens when a thesis meets a date.